The sound isn't coming from the engine. It's the airframe itself that's screaming. The thin aluminum skin of the Spitfire is making a high, desperate howl, like something alive and frightened. Squadron Leader Anthony Martindale can feel it through his gloves, through the control stick, even through the seat pressed tight against his spine. The vibration no longer feels mechanical. It feels living, an instinctive shudder that suggests the aircraft is trying to tear itself apart along its rivets. Outside the canopy, the world has dissolved into a gray-brown smear. The nose is pointed almost straight down, and the altimeter needle is spinning so rapidly it seems to be melting. 600 meter 606. At least if the instruments can even be believed. Martindale isn't entirely sure they can. No one has ever pushed an aircraft to this speed in controlled flight before. The Spitfire, Supermarine's famous elliptical wing guardian of Britain, was built to dance at around 370 mph in level flight, to zip tight turns, to climb, roll, and fight with the grace of a race-bred machine. It was never designed for this. No fighter was. And yet, here he is, 4 miles above the English countryside on April 27, 1944, riding a machine that has crossed into a speed range where the normal rules of flight no longer apply. The control stick is shivering in his grip, refusing to respond properly. There is a heavy pressure building in it, a wrong, dangerous stiffness creeping into the surfaces. At these speeds, airflow does not behave normally. It compresses and slams like a solid mass. The wings are no longer slicing through air. They are smashing into it, and the forces trying to rip them away from the fuselage feel almost biblical in scale. Martindale knows the numbers. The engineers had shown him the charts, the predicted stresses, the careful equations worked out in rooms that smelled of paper, tobacco smoke, and slide rules. But numbers on paper do not scream. They do not rattle your bones or make your jaw buzz. They do not make you wonder whether the canopy will cave in and turn you into a streak of red inside a spinning metal coffin. 22,000 feet, 18,000. The ground is still far below, but closing fast, fast enough to trigger every instinct to pull up now, to jerk back on the stick, to do something. But he doesn't. He can't. Not yet. That is the entire purpose of this test. The Air Ministry needs real data. The RAF needs answers. Spitfire pilots are dying because they don't understand what happens when you push past 500 pilotemps in a dive, when the controls lock up, when the aircraft shudders like it's breaking apart, when you find yourself sealed inside a falling brick with no authority over it. The engineers call it compressibility, a neat technical term for something that is killing men. So Martindale volunteered to learn just how bad it really gets. To take a modified Mark V Spitfire, climb to 27,500 feet, roll it inverted, and shove the nose straight down toward the countryside. To hold it there, to stay calm while the airframe tries to destroy itself, to record data at speeds that would make other nations' test pilots write farewell letters first. He isn't reckless. He is deliberate. There is a difference, though the line between the two is becoming thinner by the second. From inside a cockpit that feels like it's coming apart, those lines between courage and disaster look razor thin. The propeller in front of him is just a shimmering disk now, spinning so fast it's almost invisible. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine is howling at a level it was never built to endure. Something is going to fail. Martindale knows this. The only uncertainty is what fails first, and whether he lives through it. 4,000 feet. The Spitfire is still picking up speed, still hammering every spar and rivet, with forces that would make any structural engineer despair. Yet even as Martindale strains to stay conscious under rising G-forces, he understands perfectly why he is doing this. This isn't for glory. It's to solve a deadly problem that has been killing RAF pilots since 1942, and growing worse every month. The Luftwaffe had figured it out before the British. German pilots, especially those flying the Focke-Wulf 190, had developed a cruelly effective trick. They would lure a Spitfire into pursuit, then push over into a steep dive, straight down, at speeds the British aircraft simply couldn't handle. Not always by tearing apart physically, but by killing control. Spitfire pilots would dive after them, adrenaline high, guns ready, and somewhere past 450 mph, the controls would stop responding. The stick would stiffen, as if set in concrete. The elevators, the key surfaces that allow a pilot to pull up, would freeze solid. Men would yank with both hands, arms shaking, and nothing would change. The Spitfire would continue downward, again and again, until either the pilot somehow managed to level out at horrifyingly low altitude, or the aircraft broke apart in mid-air. Squadron reports began stacking up at fighter command. Lost contact during high-speed pursuit. Aircraft entered dive and did not recover. Pilot believed to have experienced control failure. The wording was official, measured. The truth was brutal. The RAF was losing skilled pilots not to enemy fire, but to a mysterious flight behavior no one fully understood. Wind tunnels could simulate airflow at ordinary speeds, but they couldn't duplicate what happened when a full-size aircraft pushed through 500 mph. The models were too small, the physics too extreme. The math itself began to fail in that region. By 1943, the situation was urgent. American pilots flying Thunderbolts and Mustangs were facing the same terrifying problem. Noses down, speed climbing, controls locking, and the outcome reduced to either a desperate pullout at the last possible moment or a crater smoking in a distant field. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough knew that something fundamental changed in airflow at very high speeds. They suspected compressibility, the air packing up into invisible shock waves along the wings and tail, refusing to move aside. But a suspicion isn't enough. A suspicion doesn't tell you how to fix a wing. A suspicion doesn't bring pilots home alive. The Air Ministry needed real numbers. They needed to know exactly what was happening and how to stop it. The Air Ministry needed to know exactly when the controls locked, how much force was needed to move them, whether recovery was even possible, and what level of stress the airframe could survive. And there was only one way to get that information. Mount measuring instruments onto a Spitfire, find a pilot willing to fly it, and intentionally dive straight into the danger zone. No models, no simulations, just a pilot, a machine, and the laws of physics applied in their harshest form. Other countries were moving carefully, increasing speeds in cautious, gradual steps. But the war wasn't slowing down to accommodate caution. Every week, more pilots were lost. Every month, the Luftwaffe improved their dive and escape tactics. Britain needed real answers now, even if getting those answers meant asking a man to do something that, on paper, looked almost identical to suicide. The physics seemed simple in theory, but dramatically different in reality. Air at normal speed is cooperative. It flows over wings and control surfaces smoothly, behaving exactly as the familiar equations predict. The same equations that have worked since the WWII. Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk, but air that is being struck at 500 mph doesn't have time to move aside gently. It compresses, it piles up, and when that happens, all the normal rules of flight simply break. The engineers at Farnborough understood the concept. At high speeds, air moving across the curved upper surface of the wing could actually reach supersonic speeds, even though the aircraft itself was still flying well below the speed of sound. This created shock waves, invisible, razor-thin boundaries where the airflow suddenly changed pressure and behavior. Those shock waves disrupted lift in unpredictable patches. They caused violent turbulence that hammered the tail. And most critically, they changed how the control surfaces reacted. Pilots described the experience in painfully physical language. Flight Lieutenant James McLachlan, who had survived such a dive, said the control stick felt as though it had been welded in place. Another pilot said it was like trying to fight your way through hardening cement. The elevators, the hinged surfaces on the tail that allow a pilot to pull out of a dive, would simply stop responding. A man could pull with every bit of strength in his arms and shoulders, and the nose would not rise. The aircraft would continue its fall, guided only by gravity and its own unstoppable momentum, ignoring the terrified human inside it. What made the phenomenon especially dangerous was its unpredictability. Some pilots reported heavy shaking and warning vibrations before the control lock. Others said the stick went smooth and lifeless, with almost no warning at all. Some barely recovered. Others never did. Some pilots managed to recover by reducing throttle and waiting for the speed to drop naturally. A terrifying test of self-control when the altimeter needle is racing toward zero. Others tried lowering flaps or slipping sideways into the airflow. Desperate attempts that sometimes helped and sometimes ripped the flaps clean off. A few reported that the aircraft would eventually recover on its own once it fell into the thicker air at lower altitude, but none of them could explain why. The entire phenomenon remained frustratingly inconsistent, and inconsistency in combat flying meant death. Wind tunnel experiments offered clues, but not solutions. Scale models revealed shockwave patterns at high speeds, but the results didn't translate well to real aircraft. The relationship between model aerodynamics and full-size behavior simply broke down in the transonic region, that dangerous boundary between subsonic and supersonic flight, where compressibility effects ruled everything. You could spend weeks testing a perfectly accurate 1/10th scale Spitfire wing, gather elegant data, and still have no confidence that a full-size Spitfire wouldn't just tear itself apart under the same conditions. By early 1944, the accumulated evidence suggested a critical threshold near Mach 0.84, about 570 mph at altitude. But near was not good enough. The Air Ministry needed precise answers. The exact speed at which control loss began, how control forces changed, what type of buffeting occurred, and how much stress the airframe could actually withstand. They needed to know whether a Spitfire could survive a full-speed dive. And, even more importantly, whether a pilot could recover from it without extraordinary strength or blind luck. To obtain that information, the aircraft needed full instrumentation, accelerometers to measure G-forces, pressure sensors on wings and tail surfaces, strain gauges to track how close the structure came to failure, a camera system to record the instrument panel during the dive. All that equipment added weight that would slightly reduce the Spitfire's agility, but without it, the data would be meaningless. And then there was the other requirement. Someone had to fly it. Someone had to willingly become the human part of the experiment. Squadron Leader Anthony Francis Martindale was not the kind of man people noticed immediately in a crowd. At 31, he had the thoughtful calm of someone who spent more time solving mechanical problems than making conversation. Before the war, he had been exactly that. An engineer in the world of industrial machinery, steady and methodical. When Britain mobilized, Martindale joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve, trained as a pilot, and discovered he had a rare combination of qualities: the analytical mind of an engineer and the cool nerve of a natural flyer. By 1944, he had logged over 1,000 hours in Spitfires. He had flown combat missions, trained others, and understood the machine not just as a pilot, but as a designer might, from the inside out. He trained newer pilots and eventually was assigned to the Air Fighting Development Unit at Wittering, where the RAF tested new tactics and pushed aircraft to their limits. Test flying suited him. It was flying with a purpose beyond simply fighting. It required attention to detail rather than aggression. Other pilots returned from missions talking about victories and narrow escapes. Martindale returned with notes, engine temperature readings, control feedback at different air speeds, tiny changes in behavior that most pilots never even noticed. When the Farnborough team began searching for someone to conduct the high-speed dive trials, they knew the pilot had to have a very specific mindset. He couldn't be reckless. A man seeking danger would push too far, ignore warning signs, and likely destroy both the aircraft and the precious data. But he also couldn't be overly cautious. Someone who would panic and pull out the moment the dive felt frightening would gather nothing of value. They needed someone who could think calmly while the aircraft shook itself apart around him. Someone who could separate instinctive fear from actual risk. Someone who could keep observing, keep recording, even while the dive felt like death. Martindale was exactly that person. His engineering background meant he understood the purpose of each instrument. His combat experience meant he knew how a Spitfire behaved on the edge of its performance envelope. And his personality, that quiet, focused calm that looked like detachment, but was really intense concentration, meant he could be trusted to follow the test plan without panic or bravado. When they described the mission, he didn't hesitate, didn't ask for time to think. His only questions concerned the instrument layout and the test schedule. The other pilots at Wittering thought he was insane. Diving a Spitfire past 600 miles Mach wasn't testing. It was playing roulette with physics and luck. But Martindale saw the situation differently. Pilots were dying because no one understood compressibility. The Luftwaffe was using that ignorance to kill men. Every week, the problem remained unsolved, meant more funerals. Someone had to collect the data, and it might as well be someone who would document it carefully. And though he would never say it aloud, there was also something appealing about the unknown. The transonic region was aviation's frontier, the edge of what humanity understood about flight. Nobody knew exactly what happened when a propeller aircraft approached its absolute speed limit. The Americans were exploring the same territory with their fighters, but information sharing was slow and incomplete. This was a chance to learn something no one else truly knew, to return with data from a region of flight that existed only in theory and scattered combat reports. Preparations took weeks. The chosen Spitfire Mark V was stripped of unnecessary equipment, fitted with the full instrument package, and flown repeatedly at more moderate speeds to verify everything worked exactly as intended. To make sure everything functioned properly, Martindale flew a series of practice dives, gradually working up from 300 to 400 to 500 mph, learning how the aircraft behaved as it approached the danger zone. Each flight brought him a little closer to the edge. Each flight sharpened his sense of the warning signs. Then, on a clear April morning, with calm air and excellent visibility, the engineers told him the moment had come. The aircraft was ready. The instruments were calibrated. Every preparation that could be made had been made. The only thing left was to do the test itself. The Spitfire climbed smoothly that day, rising over Farnborough with the Merlin engine running steady and confident at cruise power. Martindale kept the climb even, watching the altimeter unwind upward. 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000. The air grew thinner and colder. Frost began to creep along the edges of the canopy. Far below, the patchwork of English. Fields and hedgerows flattened into a neat map of muted greens and browns. He ran through the checklist, again in his mind. Instruments. Recording. Harness tight enough to hold him in place during the dive, but not so tight it restricted movement. Trim set neutral. Throttle responding correctly. Everything felt ordinary. Everything routine, right up until the moment it wouldn't be. 500 feet. The altimeter finally stopped rising. Martindale leveled the aircraft and drew a steady breath. This was where test flying stopped being technical procedure and became a personal confrontation with risk. He checked the instruments one last time. Accelerometers at 0, pressure gauges stable, camera system running. The engineers on the ground would be listening on the radio, though there would be little to say once the dive began. At 600 mm'er, there is no spare attention for conversation. He rolled the Spitfire inverted. The world turned upside down. Sky now below him, ground above, the horizon sliding past the canopy. For a few seconds he simply hung in the harness, feeling the blood shift toward his head. Then he pushed the stick forward, not gently, but with steady, deliberate commitment. The kind that leaves no room for hesitation. The nose dipped through the horizon and continued past it, fully vertical, then slightly beyond. The Spitfire's iconic elliptical wings bit into the thin upper air, and the aircraft began to gain speed in a way that felt less like flying and more like controlled. Falling 300 Hamipine Praetors 350. The sound of the engine changed as the propeller began to spin faster, not just from power, but from the force of the air rushing past it. 100 meet in. The airframe began to vibrate, a rising, resonant hum that came up from the structure and into Martindale's spine. Chwat. The controls still responded, but they were becoming heavier. The stick felt as though invisible weight was pressing against it. Every movement required more effort. The altimeter spun downward. Fast, 25,145,000 feet, $23,000, $20,000. The ground was still far away, but not abstract anymore. He could start to make out real detail. He could now make out individual roads, the thin silver of a river, the darker shadows of woodland. 100 trees. The buffeting began. Not violent yet, but a trembling that hinted the airflow was starting to break apart into turbulence. The wings were flexing visibly, bending upward under the aerodynamic load in a way that would alarm anyone unfamiliar with the Spitfire's design. Rigid wings fail, flexible wings survive. The Spitfire's wings were meant to bend. What meters? The engine was howling, the propeller spinning at a speed that would have horrified the engineers who built it. The reduction gear, the mechanism that slowed the engine's rotation to something the propeller could handle, was being forced far beyond its intended limits. Martindale could hear it now, a high mechanical scream beneath the roar of the wind, the unmistakable sound of metal approaching its breaking point. 18,000 feet. The buffeting worsened. The control stick was shaking violently now, vibration hammering into his arms. The controls were stiffening. That dreaded sensation pilots had compared to concrete. This was it. The compressibility zone, the point where normal aerodynamics stopped applying. Champer. The outside world blurred into a rushing smear of brown and gray, details swallowed by raw speed. 100 darned mam fernturns 606 mmPh, according to the instruments later. Though in the moment, Martindale could not look at the exact reading. He was too busy holding the dive steady, keeping the wings level, gathering the data that men had died not knowing. And then the propeller exploded. Not in a dramatic fireball. No smoke, no flames. Just a catastrophic mechanical failure too fast to truly see. The reduction gear, that precisely machined cluster of gears connecting the Merlin engine to the propeller, had been absorbing impossible loads. At 606 mph, with the propeller spinning at a savage, uncontrolled rate, something inside the gearbox reached its limit. Metal tore. Gear teeth sheared. The assembly disintegrated in an instant. The propeller, suddenly no longer attached to the engine, ripped itself clean off the nose of the aircraft. 11 feet of laminated wooden blades, spinning with lethal speed, tore loose and flew backward into the slipstream. For less than a heartbeat, Martindale saw it tumble past the canopy. A strange, floating, slow-motion image etched forever into memory. Then it vanished, dropping toward the Berkshire countryside far below. The effect on the aircraft was immediate and disastrous. The Spitfire's nose had just lost several hundred pounds of weight from its very front. The center of gravity shifted instantly rearward. Worse still, the engine, no longer burdened by the drag of the propeller, surged to horrifying RPM. The Merlin began to scream, a raw, tortured, metallic howl. The crankshaft was spinning freely now with no resistance. The whole engine threatened to tear itself apart. Martindale's hands moved automatically, pure training taking over. Throttle back. Mixture to idle cutoff. Magnetos off. Kill the engine before it destroyed itself and the airframe with it. The screaming faded to a high whine. Then silence. Sudden, unsettling silence, broken only by the roar of air rushing past the canopy. The Spitfire was now a glider. A heavy, badly shaped glider with the aerodynamic grace of a falling brick. But the trouble was only beginning. When the propeller tore free, it did more than destroy the reduction gear. The entire engine mounting had been jolted, twisted, partly torn away from its supports. Coolant lines had ruptured. Glycol, the Merlin's coolant, was spraying back along the fuselage, coating the canopy in a greasy, shimmering film. Worse, fuel was leaking. Martindale could smell it. The sharp, unmistakable scent of aviation gasoline clawing its way into the cockpit air. Something in the fuel system had cracked open, and high-octane fuel was now flooding the front of the aircraft. Without the stabilizing weight of the propeller, the damaged engine shook violently, rattling like an industrial jackhammer. The entire nose shuddered with a brutal, bone-deep vibration. The cockpit vibrated so hard his vision blurred. The instruments were bouncing so wildly they were almost unreadable. And he was still diving, still carrying far too much speed, still too high to bail out safely. 1,000 feet. He had to pull out. If he didn't recover to level flight soon, the Spitfire's wings would simply tear off under the combined stress of speed and structural damage. Martindale pulled back on the stick. Hard. It was still stiff, still resisting. But now, there was no alternative. Both hands wrapped around the column, arms straining, shoulders locked. The Spitfire's nose slowly, reluctantly, began to rise. G-forces piled on. 3 Gs, 4. Martindale's vision dimmed at the edges as blood drained from his head. The airframe groaned under the strain. Rivets were almost certainly popping loose somewhere inside the wings. None of that mattered. Either the aircraft leveled out, or he died. The horizon slid into view, tilted, then slowly straightened. The nose came up. Airspeed bled away. Drag reclaimed control. 100 by 20 by 400. The violent buffeting began to ease. The controls responded more normally now. Martindale eased back the pressure, letting the Spitfire settle into a shallow glide. He was alive. The aircraft was, unbelievably, still flying. But he was nearly 60 miles from Farnborough, with no engine, a badly damaged airframe, fuel leaking somewhere inside, and a vibration that suggested the entire front of the aircraft could come off at any moment. He was still at 11,000 feet, descending at roughly 1,000 feet per minute toward the quiet farmland below. The math was brutal. A powerless. Spitfire glided at about 8.1, 8 feet forward for every 1 foot of altitude lost. At 11,000 feet, he had roughly 88,000 feet of horizontal distance, about 16.5 miles. He was 60 miles away. He would not make Farnborough. That came to about 16.5 miles. Maybe a little more if he managed his speed perfectly. Farnborough was 60 miles away. He wasn't going to reach it. The numbers didn't lie, not unless he found a rising thermal, or suddenly grew extra wings. Martindale looked through the oil-smeared canopy and recalculated calmly. There were other options. Odiham was closer, about 30 miles to the southeast. Lasham, a glider field, was nearer still. In truth, any reasonably flat stretch of farmland long enough to land without flipping over would do. The Spitfire had already delivered the data they needed. Recovering the aircraft would be nice, but not essential. Recovering himself would be better. Still, something in Martindale's engineer's mind refused to give up that quickly. The winds aloft were blowing from the west at around 15 to 20 miles/s. That meant free distance. A gift. Despite the damage, the Spitfire was still aerodynamically clean. No flaps down, landing gear still up. Nothing dragging unnecessarily. And he still had enough altitude to experiment, trading height for distance in carefully controlled increments. He trimmed for minimum sink, the glide setting that lost altitude as slowly as possible while keeping the controls responsive. Around 120 miles/s indicated airspeed, nose slightly down. The variometer showed a descent of about 800 feet per minute. Not perfect, but workable. The vibration continued, ever present, reminding him that the engine mount was damaged and likely worsening. Every few minutes the shaking intensified for a moment, and Martindale braced for something critical to fail. But the Spitfire held. The airframe that had endured 606 meters wasn't going to surrender just because it had lost its propeller. 10,000 feet. He could see the countryside clearly now. Fields, small towns, roads winding like gray ribbons between them. Navigation was simple. The railway line leading toward Farnborough stretched across the landscape to the southeast. Follow that. Maintain glide discipline. Hope the math remained in his favor. 1,000 feet. The fuel smell inside the cockpit was getting stronger. Whatever was leaking had not stopped, and a fine mist of gasoline was likely collecting somewhere in the fuselage. One spark, from damaged wiring, metal rubbing metal, anything, and the Spitfire would become a torch. Best not to think about that. Thinking wouldn't change it. 1,000 feet. He was covering ground faster than expected. The westerly wind was doing its job, pushing him forward, and the clean airframe was giving him closer to a 10.1 glide ratio. Odiham passed beneath him, its runways and dispersal pads clear as day. Martindale kept going. Farnborough was possible now, 1,000 feet. The vibration surged again, harder this time. Something metal groaned deep in the nose. The Spitfire yawed gently left, a sign that something aerodynamic up front had shifted, possibly a panel or a twisted engine mount. But it still flew. He corrected with rudder. The aircraft steadied. He kept going. The damaged nose was causing uneven drag. Martindale corrected with rudder and kept the wings level. 1,000 Highs towers, the countryside below, was gaining detail now. Individual trees, hedgerows, the reflection of a stream. Still high enough that landing wasn't yet urgent, but low enough that this was no longer theoretical. 1,000 feet Farnborough came into view. The airfield buildings, test hangars, and runways. The calculations were holding. He could make it. Not with any spare altitude, but he would make it. 1,000 feet to harvest. The control tower would have seen him by now. A Spitfire approaching with no propeller. They would clear the airspace, dispatch fire crews, have the medics standing by. $1,000 theft, time to think about the landing. Bringing a shaking, damaged, powerless aircraft onto a runway without flipping it or breaking himself in the process. 1,000 Utairos. The landing gear controls were on the right side of the cockpit. Normally, the wheels dropped using hydraulic pressure from the engine pump. Without an engine, he had to use the manual hand pump, about 30 strokes, to lower and lock the gear. Martindale hauled the pump lever repeatedly. His arm burned, but the indicators flicked into place. Main wheels down, tail wheel down. 3 green lights. One less thing to worry about. 1000 Detroit. He turned onto final approach. The Spitfire still vibrated, still threatened to tear itself apart. But it was flying. No power meant no second chance. The glide angle was fixed. 100 fatter. The airfield boundary slipped beneath him. 100 fatter, the runway filled his view. Real, solid, unavoidable. After miles of fragile gliding, the Spitfire touched down with a jarring impact that sent fresh tremors through the damaged structure. Martindale kept the stick pulled back, holding the tail up as long as possible to slow the rollout. The tail wheel settled. He let the aircraft run. No brakes yet. With the center of gravity shifted, braking too early could flip the plane onto its nose. When the speed finally dropped below 20 mph, he applied gentle brake pressure. The Spitfire rolled to a stop. Martindale shut down the remaining electrics, unbuckled, and climbed out onto the wing. The engineers were already running toward him. Notebooks open, eyes burning with excitement. They crowded around the crippled aircraft, examining the torn engine mount, the missing propeller, the streaks of coolant and fuel along the fuselage. But what they truly cared about was the data. The instruments, the accelerometers, the pressure sensors, the onboard camera. All of it had recorded the dive. When the information was analyzed over the following weeks, it transformed Britain's understanding of high-speed flight. The instruments showed the exact moment compressibility. Effects began around 540 and 29, with a sharp spike in control resistance at 570. The pressure data revealed where shock waves formed across the upper wing surface, disrupting lift and hammering the tail. The strain gauges proved that the Spitfire's structure could survive loads far beyond what engineers had previously believed. The wings had flexed enormously at 606 mph but had not failed. Most importantly, the data proved recovery was possible. Martindale had pulled out of the dive. The elevators still retained control authority in the compressibility zone, though it required tremendous force. But it could be done. And that single fact immediately saved lives. Pilots were briefed. If the controls stiffen in a high-speed dive, do not panic. Do not bail out. Pull with everything you have. The aircraft will respond. The later Griffin engine Spitfires, introduced in late 1944, were directly improved using Martindale's data. Stronger reduction gears, modified elevator controls to reduce stick force, and subtle wing changes that delayed shockwave formation. The Mark 14 Spitfires that faced German Me-262 jets could now dive faster and recover more reliably than earlier models, giving RAF pilots entirely new tactical options. His data also fed into the early jet programs. The understanding of control loads, airframe strength, and pilot force limits became foundation knowledge for aircraft that would eventually break the sound barrier. Within months, RAF squadrons changed their training, dive recovery procedures, target speeds. Warning signs required pull forces. The Luftwaffe's once deadly dive and escape tactic suddenly lost its advantage. British pilots now followed into the compressibility zone and returned. In November 1944, Martindale received the Air Force Cross, a quiet acknowledgement, for what the citation described as outstanding devotion to duty and skill in dangerous flying, he continued. Test flying, he continued. Test flying throughout the war and into the post-war years, logging thousands of hours in dozens of different aircraft. He never sought fame for the dive. He never wrote heroic books or tried to cast himself as a legend. When journalists occasionally asked about it later in his life, he would simply shrug and say it was a necessary job that someone had to do. The engineering data mattered. The recognition did not. But among test pilots and aeronautical engineers, the dive became legendary. It represented something fundamental about how aviation truly progresses, not only through theory and calculations, but through the willingness of certain individuals to step into the unknown and return with answers. Wind tunnels and mathematical models have their place, but some questions can only be answered by climbing into the cockpit and pushing past every limit the designers once thought was absolute. The Spitfire itself emerged from the test with its reputation strengthened, not damaged. Here was an aircraft designed in the mid-1930s, at a time when 300 mph was considered astonishingly fast, and it had endured 606 kilometers tt. Yes, the propeller system had failed, but that was a gearbox issue, something engineers could reinforce. The airframe itself, Reginald Mitchell's elegant elliptical wing design, had held together under forces its creator never imagined. That structural reserve, that hidden strength built into every spar and rib, became part of the Spitfire's quiet legacy. Fighter doctrine around the world shifted in part because of what Martindale demonstrated. The Americans shared results from their own high-speed tests, and a clearer picture formed of how different aircraft behaved in the transonic zone. The British shared Martindale's data in return. International cooperation, driven by the simple fact that pilots' lives were on the line, accelerated everyone's understanding. So, when the first generation of jet fighters arrived, aircraft capable of approaching the sound barrier in level flight, the engineers were ready. They already knew what shock waves could do to lift, to control surfaces, to structural integrity, because propeller-driven fighters like Martindale's Spitfire had already scouted the edge of that frontier. The dive also marked a philosophical turning point in test flying. Before Martindale, testing was conservative, always incremental, always staying within predicted safety margins. Afterward, there was recognition that some answers required boldness, not recklessness, but calm, measured courage, the ability to act rationally while facing situations that would terrify most pilots. Test pilots like Chuck Yeager, who broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 in 1947, built upon lessons earned by men like Martindale, who proved a pilot could think clearly even while the aircraft seemed to be tearing itself apart. Squadron Leader Anthony Martindale survived the war, lived a long, quiet life, and passed away in 2016 at the age of 103. The Spitfire he flew that day, serial number EN409, was repaired, returned to flying duty, and survived the war as well. The data it produced lived on, in textbooks, in engineering guidelines, in the accumulated knowledge that made modern aviation possible. One man, one aircraft, one dive. Out of 6 mph towards Earth, and the discipline to hold steady while everything around him screamed to let go. Not heroism in the theatrical sense, just courage in the truest form.